It was a regular Friday evening, and I was in the middle of wrapping up work when my phone rang. It was unusual. My dad wasn't one to call out of the blue, especially not at this hour. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was neither my dad's nor anyone familiar. The words that followed froze me to the core. There's been an accident. Your father is in critical condition. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I found my way to the hospital, the hallway blurring as I made my way to the waiting area, where I found Lisa, my stepmother. She looked as if the world had dropped out from under her. The moment she saw me, she stood up, her eyes wide with both shock and relief, and pulled me into an embrace. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. We sat in silence, waiting for any news from the doctors, each minute stretching into an eternity. I barely knew Lisa. She had married my dad only 2 years ago, and we hadn't spent much time together. But at that moment, it didn't matter. We were bound by the same fear, the same helplessness, as we waited for an update on his condition. Hours passed, and finally, the doctor emerged. The news was mixed. Dad was stable, but in critical condition, with several surgeries ahead and a long recovery expected. They assured us he was a fighter, but the recovery would be slow, and he'd need support. As the reality of the situation settled in, I looked at Lisa, who seemed lost, unsure of how she would manage everything alone. Without thinking, I made the decision. "I'll stay with you," I said. "I'll help however I can." She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that we'd get through this together. The next day, I packed a bag and moved into Dad and Lisa's home. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier with Dad's absence. I could see the strain on Lisa's face, the weight of worry etched into her every movement. She was trying to stay strong, to hold it all together, but there were moments when I'd catch her staring off, lost in thought. That first week, we fell into a rhythm. During the day, we'd take turns visiting Dad at the hospital, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, and hoping he'd come back to us. Evenings were filled with quiet dinners, where conversation was minimal, but the silence was filled with unspoken understanding. One night, as we sat across from each other in the dimly lit kitchen, Lisa finally broke the silence. "I don't know how I'd be getting through this without you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, really?" I shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "We're in this together," I said simply. "He's my dad, and you're, well, family." A small, sad smile appeared on her face. "Family, yes." There was something in the way she said it, a quiet sadness that I couldn't quite place. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I held back, uncertain of what that would mean. Days turned into weeks, and as we moved through the routine, our bond grew stronger. We spent countless hours together, at the hospital handling paperwork, managing the household. She was strong, determined, and far more resilient than I had ever imagined, and I found myself admiring her, feeling a respect that I hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found Lisa sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at the darkened yard. I joined her, and we sat in comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. "I sometimes wonder if he knew," she said softly, almost to herself. "Knew what?" I asked, curious. She hesitated, glancing over at me before looking away. "How much I love him. I mean, we'd only been married a couple of years, and things were just starting to settle. And now, her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. I don't know if I told him enough. I felt a pang of empathy, a quiet understanding of the fear and guilt that she was carrying. "He knows," I assured her. "My dad might not say much, but he can feel it. Anyone can see how much you care about him." She looked at me, her gaze softening. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a lot." For a moment, our eyes met, and there was something there, an unspoken connection that neither of us could explain. It was fleeting, but powerful, a shared vulnerability that brought us closer in ways we hadn't anticipated. As the weeks wore on, we settled into a quiet companionship, each of us leaning on the other for support. There were moments of laughter, rare but treasured, and moments of silence that felt oddly comforting. She became my anchor in a way, someone who understood the weight of the uncertainty we both felt. One night, after returning from the hospital, Lisa poured us each a glass of wine. "To your dad's recovery," she said, raising her glass with a tired smile. "To Dad," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. We sipped our wine in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As the evening wore on, she began sharing stories about her life with my dad. Funny moments, little quirks I hadn't known about him. It was strange, hearing her talk about him with such fondness. Yet it was also comforting, a reminder of the love that had brought them together. At one point, she looked at me, her eyes soft. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured. "I don't think I could do this alone." I nodded, feeling a quiet thrill at her words, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt before. "I'm glad too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached out, placing a hand on mine, and the warmth of her touch sent a jolt through me. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt different. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge the connection I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we sat in silence, our hands resting together, the weight of the moment settling over us. The next morning, I woke early and decided to take a quick shower before heading to the hospital. I was in the middle of rinsing off when I heard a soft knock on the door. "Are you all right in there?" Lisa's voice called from the other side. "Yeah, just finishing up," I replied, though my heart skipped a beat at the sound of her voice. There was a brief pause, and then, to my surprise, the door opened a crack. "Sorry, I thought you might need a fresh towel," she said, stepping inside with a warm, fluffy towel in her hands. "Oh, thanks," I managed, feeling my cheeks flush. She smiled, holding out the towel as she stepped closer, her gaze meeting mine. There was a warmth in her eyes, a quiet compassion that left me feeling both comforted and something more. I took the towel from her, mumbling my thanks, and as she turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of something I couldn't quite place, a longing, a sense of wanting her to stay just a moment longer. "Lisa," I said softly, barely even realizing I'd spoken. She paused, turning to look at me, her expression soft. "Yes." I hesitated, feeling a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite explain. "Thank you for everything." She smiled, her gaze lingering on mine. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, remember?" For a moment, we stood there in silence, the warmth of her presence filling the room. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Over the next few days, our routine continued. We'd spend our mornings at the hospital, sitting by Dad's bedside, offering him silent encouragement as he lay motionless, each of us hoping for any sign of recovery. Evenings were spent back at home, where we would share quiet dinners, finding comfort in each other's presence. There was something about Lisa that I hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength that kept her going even in the most difficult moments. I'd see her hide her tears, only letting them fall when she thought I wasn't looking. And each time, I felt a surge of empathy, a desire to console her, to be there for her in ways I hadn't considered before. One night, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I noticed her sitting in the living room, lost in thought. Her face looked tired, weighed down by the worry and sleepless nights. On impulse, I walked over and sat down beside her. "You should rest," I said softly. "You're doing so much. You need to take care of yourself, too." She glanced at me, a small smile forming on her lips. "I could say the same to you," she replied, her voice gentle. We sat in silence for a moment, each of us feeling the weight of everything we were carrying. Then, without thinking, I reached over and took her hand. It was a small gesture, but the warmth of her hand in mine brought a sense of comfort I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you for being here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I could do this alone." I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone," I replied, feeling a quiet thrill at the words. "We'll get through this together." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment I felt a connection that went beyond words. It was a bond forged in the midst of our shared pain, an understanding that neither of us had to face this alone. As the days passed, our bond only grew stronger. We'd often go for walks in the evening, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the night. One evening, as we strolled through the neighborhood, Lisa seemed particularly quiet, her gaze distant. "Is everything okay?" I asked gently, breaking the silence. She glanced at me, a sad smile on her face. I miss him," she murmured. "He's always been my rock, and now, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do." I felt a pang of empathy, a deep urge to console her. "You're stronger than you think," I said softly. "You've been handling everything on your own, and you're still here, still holding it together." She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. Without thinking, I reached out, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me, letting out a shaky breath, and I felt a surge of protectiveness, a desire to be there for her in every way possible. As we continued walking, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, I realized that our connection had deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just my stepmother. She had become someone I cared about, someone I wanted to protect. That night, as we sat on the couch, she shared more about her life with my dad, the good moments, the struggles, the dreams they'd had. It was strange hearing her talk about him with such love and honesty, but it also made me feel closer to her, more connected in a way that was hard to explain. At one point, her voice broke, and I saw tears in her eyes. Without thinking, I reached over, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that left my heart racing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a surge of emotion, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I took her hand, letting the silence speak for me. She held my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and I realized that I hadn't felt this close to anyone in a long time. The bond we shared was something rare, something that went beyond words, and as the night wore on, I found myself unable to look away from her. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment. I kept replaying it in my mind, the way her hand had felt in mine, the look in her eyes, the warmth that had settled over us. It was as if something had shifted, something I couldn't quite understand, but couldn't ignore. Lisa seemed different too, quieter, more introspective. There was a tension between us, a silent understanding that neither of us wanted to address. It was as if we were both aware of the bond we shared, but afraid to give it a name, to acknowledge what it meant. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, the silence between us felt heavier than usual. She glanced at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and uncertainty. I don't know what I'd do without you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words struck a chord, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. "You're not alone," I replied softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm here for as long as you need me." She looked at me, her gaze lingering, and in that moment, I felt an unspoken connection pass between us, a bond that went beyond words, a feeling that neither of us could explain. As the days continued, the tension between us grew stronger, each of us acutely aware of the bond we shared but unable to address it. One night, after returning from the hospital, Lisa invited me to sit with her on the porch. The cool night air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the quiet hum of crickets creating a sense of calm. We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Then, without warning, she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "Do you ever wonder how things might have been different?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, feeling my heart race. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing away before looking back at me. "If we'd met under different circumstances, if things had been simpler." Her words hung in the air, a quiet confession that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. I wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to tell her that I felt the same way, but the weight of our connection, the complexity of our situation, held me back. "Lisa," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her gaze softening. And in that moment, I felt a surge of emotion, a quiet thrill that left me breathless. I wanted to tell her how much she meant to me, how grateful I was for this time together, but the words felt too heavy, too full of meaning. Instead, we sat in silence, our hands resting together, the weight of the moment settling over us. And as the night wore on, I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something I couldn't ignore, something that would stay with me long after this summer had ended. Another week passed, and my father's condition began to show small signs of improvement. Lisa and I clung to that hope, visiting him daily, speaking to him even when he lay unresponsive, believing that somehow he could hear us. The bond between us only grew stronger, both of us drawing strength from each other. But with that bond came feelings I couldn't shake, emotions that had begun to weigh on me more heavily with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly long day, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, each nursing a glass of wine, our usual evening ritual. We talked about Dad's progress, about how grateful we were for even the slightest improvement, but underneath our words was a tension, a shared awareness of something deeper. At one point, I noticed her looking at me, her gaze soft and thoughtful. "You've been a rock through all of this," she murmured. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Her words stirred something within me, and I felt a warmth spread through me. "I'm just glad to be here for you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we sat in silence, our gazes locked, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid between us. She reached out, her hand resting gently on mine, and the warmth of her touch sent a jolt through me. It was such a simple gesture, yet it felt intimate, different from anything we'd shared before. That night, as we sat together on the couch, the air between us felt charged, filled with an intensity that neither of us could ignore. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she meant to me, but the words felt too heavy, too complex. Instead, I simply looked at her, letting the silence speak for me. She seemed to understand, her gaze softening, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped, as if the rest of the world had faded away. "Do you ever wonder how things might have been different?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. I swallowed, feeling my heart race. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "But things are complicated." She nodded, her gaze lingering on mine. "I know, but I can't ignore how I feel." Her words hung in the air, a quiet confession that left me feeling both exhilarated and terrified. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that I felt the same way, but the weight of our situation, the reality of our circumstances, held me back. "Lisa," I began, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of vulnerability and longing. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to be there for her, to offer her the comfort and support she needed. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand gently cupping her cheek. She leaned into my touch, her eyes closing briefly, and I could feel the warmth of her skin beneath my fingers, a quiet connection that went beyond words. When she opened her eyes, there was something in her gaze, a depth of emotion that took my breath away. And as we sat there, lost in each other, I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something I couldn't ignore, something that had become a part of who we were. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, a sense of anticipation that left us both on edge. We continued our routine, visiting Dad at the hospital, managing the household together, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared awareness of the bond that had formed. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch, the cool night air filling the space around us, she turned to me, her gaze soft. "Do you think we're doing something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, feeling a mixture of guilt and longing. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I can't ignore what I feel." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "Neither can I." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of our feelings pressing down on us. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, We both leaned in, our faces inches apart, the warmth of her breath on my skin. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge the line we were crossing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a gentle, hesitant kiss, a quiet confession of everything we couldn't say. When we finally pulled away, her eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and longing. I didn't mean for this to happen, she murmured, her voice trembling. Neither did I replied, my heart racing. But I don't regret it. She looked at me, her gaze softening. And in that moment, I knew that this connection, this bond, was something that went beyond words, something that neither of us could ignore. In the days that followed, we tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the memory of that night lingered, a silent reminder of the bond we shared. There was a new tension between us, a quiet understanding that we had crossed a line, but neither of us knew how to move forward. Each time our eyes met, I could see the same conflict in her gaze, the same mixture of guilt and longing that I felt. We were both caught between our feelings and our sense of responsibility, unsure of how to navigate the complex emotions that had taken hold. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, she finally broke the silence. I don't know where we go from here, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, feeling a surge of emotion. I don't either, I replied honestly. But I know that I care about you. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, it felt as if everything else had faded away, as if the rest of the world didn't matter. But then reality came crashing back, and I was reminded of the complications, the impossibility of what we were feeling. We can't keep doing this, she whispered, her voice filled with sadness. It's not fair to him. I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. I know, but I don't know how to stop. She looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of love and regret. Maybe it's time for us to take a step back. Her words struck a chord, and I felt a sense of loss, a quiet emptiness that settled over me. I wanted to protest, to tell her that we could find a way, but I knew that she was right, that our connection, however strong, was built on fragile ground. As we sat there, the silence stretching between us, I realized that this bond, this closeness, was something I would carry with me, a memory that would stay with me long after this chapter had ended. In the days that followed our quiet confession, Lisa and I tried to return to normal. We spoke less, each of us careful to avoid the glances that had once held so much meaning. There was a quiet understanding between us now, a mutual decision to keep our feelings in check. But no matter how much we tried, the tension remained, lingering in the air like an unspoken secret. One evening, as we returned from the hospital, Lisa broke the silence. I think it's time we prepare for your dad to come home, she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. I nodded, trying to ignore the pang of loss that her words evoked. Of course, he'll need a lot of support. She gave me a sad smile, one that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. Yes, but we'll get through it together. Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the bond we had shared. And as I looked at her, I realized that our time together was coming to an end, that soon we would have to return to the roles we had played before. In the following days, we threw ourselves into preparations, each of us focused on making sure the house was ready for my father's return. We moved furniture, set up a hospital bed, rearranged the living room to make it easier for him to move around. But in between the tasks, there were moments when our eyes would meet, when our hands would brush, and the unspoken connection between us would surface, reminding us of everything we couldn't have. One evening, as we sat together in the kitchen, Lisa looked at me, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "Thank you for everything you've done," she murmured. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." I nodded, feeling a quiet ache in my chest. "I'll still be here to help as much as I can." She gave me a sad smile, her hand reaching across the table to rest on mine. "I know, but it'll be different now, won't it?" Her words struck a chord, and I felt a surge of sadness, a sense of loss that left me feeling hollow. "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It will. We sat in silence, each of us clinging to the moment, knowing that it was one of our last. And as the evening wore on, I realized that this was our goodbye, a farewell to the bond we had shared, a connection that had changed us both in ways we couldn't fully understand. The day my father came home was both joyful and heartbreaking. Lisa and I welcomed him with open arms, our faces bright with smiles that masked the complicated emotions beneath the surface. He looked weaker than before, but his spirit was strong, and I could see the relief in Lisa's eyes as she held his hand, grateful to have him back. As the days passed, Lisa and I fell back into our roles, each of us careful to keep a respectful distance, our shared moments becoming fewer and far between. I spent more time at work trying to give them space, and Lisa focused on caring for my father, pouring all her energy into his recovery. But even as we tried to move forward, the memory of our connection lingered, a quiet presence that haunted each interaction, each fleeting glance. It was as if we were both holding onto a piece of something that couldn't be reclaimed, a bond that had been forged in our darkest moments, but was now relegated to the shadows. One evening, as I was preparing to leave after a long day, my father called me into the living room. He looked tired but happy, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Son," he began, his voice gentle, "I just want to thank you for everything you did while I was in the hospital. I know it wasn't easy, but you were there for Lisa when she needed you most." His words struck a nerve, and I felt a surge of guilt, a quiet reminder of everything I had tried to bury. "I'm glad I could help, Dad," I replied, my voice barely steady. He gave me a warm smile, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Lisa told me how much she relied on you, how much you supported her. I'm so proud of the man you've become." The weight of his words settled over me, a mixture of pride and shame that left me feeling conflicted. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything that had happened, but I knew that it would only cause pain, that our bond, however complicated, was better left unspoken. "Thank you, Dad," I replied, forcing a smile. "It means a lot." As I left the room, I felt the weight of the secret we shared pressing down on me, a reminder of everything we had left behind. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put distance between myself and Lisa, each of us focusing on our own responsibilities, on rebuilding our lives around my father's recovery. But the memory of our connection lingered, a quiet presence that refused to fade. One afternoon, as I was preparing to leave for the day, Lisa stopped me in the hallway. Her gaze was soft, filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, and I could see the weight of everything we had shared in her eyes. "Thank you for being there for me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I would have done without you." I nodded, feeling a quiet ache in my chest. "I'll always be here for you, even if things are different now." She gave me a sad smile, and for a moment, we stood in silence, each of us holding onto the memory of our time together, a bond that had changed us both in ways we couldn't fully understand. "Take care of him," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I will," she replied, her gaze lingering on mine. As I turned to leave, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the bond we had shared, a connection that would stay with us, a memory that would linger long after we had said goodbye. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of that summer remained vivid in my mind. The connection I had shared with Lisa was something rare, something that had left an indelible mark on both of us. And though we had chosen to move forward, to let go of what had been, the memory of our bond remained, a quiet reminder of a time when we had found solace in each other. Whenever I thought of her, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a sense of loss for what we couldn't have, but also a deep appreciation for the support we had offered each other in our darkest moments. And though our lives had returned to normal, the memory of that connection, that bond, stayed with me, a silent presence that reminded me of everything we had left unsaid. It was a bittersweet reminder of the summer we had shared, a connection that had changed us both, a memory that would stay with us for the rest of our lives.